Welcome to Spooky History. In today's episode, we're stepping into the world of Ed and Lorraine Warren and the Conjuring of Bathsheba Sherman. The Conjuring universe is a series of interconnected horror films apparently based on true stories drawn from Ed and Lorraine Warren, two paranormal investigators. Which begs the question, really. If it's called a universe and it's all real, do we live in the Conjuring universe? It all began in June of 1970. The Perron family, parents Roger and Carolyn, and their 5 daughters moved into what is known as the Old Arnold Estate in Harrisville, Rhode Island. 200 acres of land with a big barn and a farmhouse originally built in 1736. Plenty of space for Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cynthia and April to run and grow up in. With one small caveat. On the day the family moved in, the previous owner told her father, "Leave the lights on at night." What he didn't tell the family was quite a lot, actually. According to Andrea Perron, 8 generations of one extended family lived and died in that house prior to our arrival. Some of them never left. In that time, the Arnold family had suffered 2 suicides by hanging, 1 by poison, the murder of an 11-year-old Prudence S. Arnold by a farmhand, 2 drownings and 4 deaths by exposure, amongst other premature deaths. Of course, in an age before hospitals and in a world of rough outdoor physical labour, that number of tragedies isn't actually as shocking as it looks for 8 generations of history, especially when some of these didn't even happen on the property, such as the murder of Prudence, whose official death record places her in a different state. It's really upsetting we're talking about Prudence, because Prudence is the name of my cat. But there was obviously something in the house. The family arrived. It's also really upsetting for the kid. But there was obviously something in the house. The family arrived during an icy snowstorm to a house that creaked, slammed and whispered at night. Strange voices could be heard in deserted rooms and furniture moved about on its own. Andrea Perron said, "Everyone who has lived in the house that we know of has experienced this. Some have left screaming and running for their lives. The man who moved in to begin the restoration on the house when we sold it left screaming without his car, without his tools, without his clothing. He never went back to the house, and consequently the people who owned it, the adjacent landowners, never moved in, and it sat vacant for years. One night, 8-year-old Cindy came sobbing into Andrea's bedroom and into her bed, saying that she heard a repeated whisper in her room, saying again and again, 'There are 7 dead soldiers in the walls.' Another spirit kept the family awake at night, crying, 'Mama.' Another April made friends with and called Manny. Some spirits would act up and make loud noises for attention when guests were around. A father, son and dog would appear at the top of the staircase and stare at a wall, like it was a window, never making eye contact with the Perrons. The family began to experience the horrendous stink of rotting flesh. They said their beds shook at 5:15 each morning, and they began avoiding the dirt-floored cellar as much as they could, as it seemed a spirit hotspot, though Roger often had to go down to repair the failing heating system, where he'd feel this cold, stinking presence beside him. Once, while reclining on the sofa, Mother Carolyn Perron suddenly felt a piercing type of pain in her calf, and then the muscle began to spasm. She found a puddle of blood on her leg around a perfectly concentric circular wound, as if a large sewing needle had impaled her skin. There was nothing around that could have caused it. When the Warrens came over to investigate, the wound in Carolyn's calf convinced them the demonic entity in the house was that of Bathsheba Sherman. Sherman had lived on a neighbouring farm in the 1800s. She obviously wasn't the nicest person, as it was said she beat and starved the staff of her farm. But her reputation got dramatically worse when a baby died in her care, bearing a mortal wound seemingly caused by a large sewing needle that had been impaled at the base of the child's skull. It was this wound which convinced the Warrens that Bathsheba was involved in the Perrons' current plight, though at the time a court cleared her of any wrongdoing due to insufficient evidence. That hasn't stopped rumours spreading that Bathsheba had sacrificed the child to the devil, and the Conjuring film taking things a lot further than even the Warrens. As Lorraine said, "That's the original farmhouse. It was built in 1863 by a man named Jedson Sherman, who was married to a woman named Bathsheba. She's related to Marytown, Esther. She's one of the women accused of witchcraft in Salem. She was hung during the trials. So after Bathsheba married Jedson, they had a baby, and when the baby was 7 days old, Jedson caught her sacrificing it in front of the fireplace. She ran out to that tree by the dock, climbed up, proclaimed her love to Satan, cursed anyone who tried to take her land, and hung herself. Time of death was pronounced at 3:07 in the morning. Bathsheba Sherman must have been a very slow tree climber, as on the way she had several more children, one of which was married by the time she died, aged 73, roughly 4 years after her husband Judson Sherman, who had presumably spent the whole time staring at her struggling up the tree and dropping the occasional baby. Just see it kind of plopping out. On the whole, it seems unlikely Bathsheba proclaimed her love for Satan or killed herself, considering her neighbours buried her in the church graveyard and marked her grave with a headstone, two things that tended not to happen with Satanists or suicides. It was later rumoured that her body turned to stone when she died, so if she did hang herself, hopefully no one was standing underneath her when she took her last breath. The unsupported statements she was related to a Salem witch also seems to imply that this true story believes the 20 men and women who were executed in Salem, pressed to death, or even more who died in prison that we can't know about, were abusers rather than victims, which is something Hocus Pocus and WandaVision did, I guess? Another of the embellishments of the film is the doll Annabelle, which played no part in the Perron haunting. A nursing student named Donna received the Raggedy Ann doll, which looks like a real doll and not Chucky doing a walk of shame during his goth phase, from her mother as a birthday present in 1968. Shortly after, Donna and her roommate Angie, the doll, began moving around their flat, seemingly on its own and leaving them childlike messages scribbled onto parchment paper. These things escalated when their friend Lou, who had been staying with them, claimed that the doll had scratched his chest and tried to strangle him during the night. Blood was also found dripping from Annabelle. A séance was held. The medium informed them that the doll was possessed by the spirit of a young girl named Annabelle who had lived on the land the flats were built on. When she was just 7 years old, Annabelle's lifeless body was found in a field where the apartments now stand. At the recommendation of the Warrens, an exorcism of the apartment was performed, and at Donna's request, the Warrens took the Annabelle doll into their possession, where it still remains today. I mean, the Warrens are dead, so they kind of don't have it anymore, technically. On the way back, their car suffered multiple mechanical failures, which is the closest Annabelle Comes Home gets to being based on a true story, with the rest being just a collection of genre elements and references which the filmmakers liked but hadn't found a home for. Now, it looks like we've accidentally covered the entire true story of Annabelle trilogy too. Oops. But in our defense, there's so little to it that it's easy to do. Getting back to the Perrons. Most of the Perron family had encountered Bathsheba at one time or another, but it seemed to manifest and threaten matriarch Carolyn the most, hurting her physically multiple times, appearing in the middle of the night and screaming, get out, I'll drive you out with death and gloom," at her, and making it very clear that she saw herself as the mistress of both the house and the family, including molesting husband Roger. The Warrens grew up convinced that Bathsheba, not satisfied with ordinary haunting, had actually possessed the body of Carolyn. Said Andrea Perron, "There was no exorcism like in the film. It was a séance that went very wrong. What they portrayed in the film was not what happened. It, the séance, was scarier. It was the most terrifying night of my life. During the séance, Carolyn was picked up and thrown into another room, her body slamming to the ground. According to Andrea, my mother began to speak a language not of this world, in a voice not her own. Her chair levitated and she was thrown across the room." Andrea suspects the medium opened a door she couldn't close. Her mother, she said, most likely had a concussion from the incident and took a long time to come out of the condition she was in. She was utterly drained and in pain. And unlike the 2013 film, this possession didn't have a happy ending. It wasn't Bathsheba who was thrown out, but the Warrens, as the Perron family believed they had only made things worse and infuriated the presence in the house. Once the Warrens were gone, Bathsheba left the body of Carolyn, but continued her previous, less extreme activity. I guess the film does say it's based on the Warrens' case files, so maybe they just got a bit confused about who threw who out when they were typing everything up. It is also implied in the film that the family moved out after the exorcism, but the real Perron family lived pretty happily most of the time in the farmhouse for approximately 10 years, until June of 1980. For the most part, we did get used to it, Perron said of the spirit presence. According to her, most of the family would willingly move back into the house, and she herself has visited the property on several occasions, and always feels like I'm home when I'm there. It's just such a huge part of our lives and memories. My mother once said, We left the farm, but it will never leave us. They'd even tried holding on to the house for as long as possible, selling off most of the property's 200 acres when a pipe burst and flooded their business, leaving the property today with only 8.5 acres of land. Despite this, the family has maintained the film is mostly accurate. In Andrea's words, "The Conjuring is essentially true. There are elements of fiction in it, however, for the most part, in broad sweeping strokes, it captures the true elements of what we endured for 10 years in this farmhouse." Of course, the film is based on the Warrens' story, not the Perrons, and the Warrens' credibility has been questioned. Neurologist Stephen Novella, president of the New England Skeptical Society, who has investigated the Warrens in the past, said, "The Warrens are good at telling ghost stories. You could do a lot of movies based on the stories they have spun, but there's absolutely no reason to believe there is any legitimacy to them. As well as that, the dramatic needs of a horror film can stretch the story further than it otherwise would, and of course there is the entire question of what constitutes valid testimony in the first place. However, some of the subsequent owners of the Perrons' home have also experienced weird phenomena, though never to the same extent. Do we all just live in the Conjuring universe? I think we just might, though hopefully mostly as extras, unless... What's that behind you? Only joking. It's just the devil. However, between our Amityville video, which covered the opening act of The Conjuring 2, the Enfield case, and our Devil Made Me Do It one, and this one, we've now intentionally or accidentally covered almost all of the Conjuring universe films, but there are still a few stories remaining, so let us know in the comments if you'd like a full episode about the actual Enfield poltergeist from The Conjuring 2, La Llorona, or any other ideas for future episodes. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Spooky History. You can find us on most social media at Spooky His Show, and you can support us with donations at paypal.me/noisyghost. Thanks for watching, and please do have nightmares. Goodbye.